When people began to settle and cultivate, they confronted the need to measure and apportion land and harvests. How long should a field be? How wide? How many grains of barley make a fair share? Early societies devised units and methods to answer these questions. In ancient Mesopotamia, standardized clay tablets and carved stone weights established measures for barley, dates, and oil. Surveyors walked the edges of floodplain fields with ropes knotted at regular intervals, laying out boundaries that would later be redrawn after each inundation. In Egypt, scribes used cubits marked on rods to determine the dimensions of plots for taxation. Geometry was not an abstract pursuit, but a practical art born of irrigation channels and property lines. Across Asia, the careful counting of paddy seedlings and the spacing of them in neat grids were acts of mathematical mindfulness. These early systems of measurement laid the foundation for later mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. They arose from the simple need to share resources fairly and to plan the future. In remembering them, we can imagine quiet scenes: a farmer stretching a rope along a furrow, a scribe marking numbers on clay, the soft murmur of voices negotiating how to divide a harvest. The cultivation of crops also prompted communities to articulate norms and laws. Once land became valuable, questions arose about who could plant where, who could draw water from a canal, and what happens when a neighbor's cattle trample another's field. In the Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone nearly 4,000 years ago, there are clauses about negligence, compensation for lost harvests, and penalties for diverting irrigation water. Such rules reflect a world where farming was central and disputes could be communal crises. In many regions, common fields coexisted with privately tended plots. Villages in medieval Europe practiced the open field system, rotating crops across strips of land allocated each season. Everyone shared the fallow fields for grazing. In England, ancient rites allowed the poor to glean leftover grain after harvest. In East Africa, water committees managed rights to scarce spring flows, ensuring that all families could water their fields and animals. These systems required negotiation, trust, and a sense of fairness. They remind us that agriculture is not merely an economic activity, but a social contract. The act of planting a seed also implicates one in a web of obligations and reciprocity with neighbors and with future generations. Imagining a council of elders sitting beneath a tree, quietly discussing water rights, invites us to appreciate the deliberation and care that sustained early farming communities. Alongside the legal and mathematical frameworks developed by early farmers, songs and stories flowed as easily as irrigation water. Working in the fields is repetitive, and people often filled that repetition with rhythm. In many cultures, communal singing coordinated the EC, timing of planting or harvesting. In Southeast Asia, rice planting songs set the pace for workers moving through flooded paddies. In West Africa, call and response songs accompanied the pounding of millet or sorghum. These songs carried knowledge about when to sow, how to weed, and what signs of the sky to heed. Proverbs and folk tales encoded agricultural wisdom. A single seed can feed a family, or when the Pleiades rise, plant your millet. Such sayings served as memory aids, guidelines, and sometimes simple comforts during long days of labor. Lullabies often referenced crops and animals, inviting children to dream about growing things. In the evenings, when tools were set aside, people might gather to tell stories of ancestral farmers, trickster spirits who stole corn, or deities who taught humans how to make beer. In these oral traditions, agriculture was not separate from cultural identity. It was woven into the songs that lulled children to sleep and the myths that anchored community. To think of these voices whispering across time is to hear a gentle continuity, a hum of human care that runs parallel to the clatter of tools and the rustle of crops. Seeds themselves became carriers of memory and story. A seed saved and passed down through generations is more than a future plant. It is a record of relationships. In some Andean communities, families kept small caches of potatoes and quinoa seeds, each variety with a name, a lineage, and a history of what fields it thrived in. In India, farmers selected and saved grains of rice from the sturdiest stalks, trusting their shape and color to remind them of past seasons. The act of saving seed is an act of hope, a commitment to the next cycle. It also preserves genetic diversity that modern monocultures often erode. Seed banks today continue this work on a larger scale, storing samples of thousands of crop varieties in cold vaults deep in mountainsides. The famous vault in Svalbard, Norway, safeguards seeds from around the world against catastrophe. Yet in countless villages, seed saving remains a communal practice. During quiet evenings, elders might sort through ears of corn or pods of beans, choosing the plumpest kernels, telling stories about the fields from which they came, and recalling which ancestor first planted them. In this way, seeds are both biological potential and social memory. They embody continuity and connection, bridging the lives of those who came before with those yet to be born. As farmers learn to nurture crops, they also learn to care for the creatures that make cultivation possible. Pollinators, bees, butterflies, beetles, and birds play a crucial role in fertilizing many plants. Ancient beekeeping is documented in Egyptian tomb paintings where men smoke hives to calm bees before extracting honey. In Greece, small clay pots placed under the eaves of houses provided shelter for mason bees. In Mesoamerica, stingless bees were kept in hollow logs, their honey considered sacred. Farmers observed that abundance of flowers and the presence of bees were connected, and they sometimes planted hedgerows and flowering herbs to attract these helpers. The relationship between farmers and pollinators is another example of reciprocity. Humans protect and provide habitat. Insects and birds ensure fruit and seed. This awareness has resurged in modern times as concerns about colony collapse disorder and habitat loss have led gardeners and farmers to plant pollinator-friendly species. Watching a bee land softly on a blossom, dusted with pollen like fine gold, invites a moment of quiet appreciation for the small creatures upon which our food depends. The cycles of planting and harvesting also drew human eyes upward. Astronomy and agriculture have long been intertwined. Farmers needed to know when to sow and when to reap, and so they watched the sun's path, the appearance of certain stars, the phases of the moon. In ancient China, imperial astronomers recorded solstices and equinoxes to calibrate calendars. Misalignment could mean missing the optimal time to plant rice. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, monumental architecture such as the Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza is aligned so that during equinoxes, light and shadow create the illusion of a serpent descending the pyramid, an astronomical marker tied to agricultural fertility. In Europe, stone circles like Newgrange and Stonehenge are oriented to capture the sunrise at solstices, perhaps to coordinate seasonal rituals. These alignments suggest a deep connection between sky and soil. Observing the heavens was not just for priests, but for farmers whose livelihoods depended on understanding seasonal change. Under a clear night sky, away from modern lights, the Milky Way arches overhead, as it did for the first farmers. Stars still rise and set, offering a quiet rhythm that has guided human hands for millennia. Agriculture also influenced family life and gender roles in subtle ways. In hunter-gatherer societies, labor was often shared, with men hunting and women gathering, though roles were fluid and complementary. Settled farming demanded different patterns. Fields needed tending at specific times, animals needed daily care, and storage and cooking became more elaborate. In many early farming communities, women continued to play a central role in planting, weeding, harvesting, and processing food. Their knowledge of seeds, soil, and seasons was profound. Men might take on tasks like plowing with animals or clearing land. As surpluses accumulated, inheritance and descent could affect how work and property were organized. Some societies traced lineage through mothers, others through fathers, shaping who had rights to land and livestock. The rhythms of domestic life changed. Permanent dwellings allowed for new forms of craftwork and childcare. Children grew up watching their elders work the same fields, learning through observation and participation. Thinking about these patterns invites empathy for the daily lives behind archaeological remains, the hands that wove baskets, the backs bent over seedlings, the voices teaching and comforting. These rhythms were intimate and enduring, forming the fabric of early agrarian societies. Over time, communities developed shared spaces and practices to manage resources held in common. The concept of the commons land or water shared by all has deep agricultural roots. In Europe, village greens provided pasturage for livestock. In parts of Asia, irrigation canals were maintained collectively, with schedules for water use negotiated among farmers. Commons were not free-for-alls. They were governed by customs and agreements that balanced individual needs with the health of the whole. Many indigenous societies maintained hunting grounds and fishing streams communally, with protocols to prevent overuse. When colonization and privatization later enclosed these shared lands, social fabrics were strained. In modern times, community gardens in urban neighborhoods revived the idea of common cultivation. People come together to plant, weed, and harvest in spaces that might otherwise be empty lots. The shared labor and harvest create social bonds and provide fresh produce. These gardens show that the spirit of the commons persists, reminding us that not all resources must be privately owned. They offer a quiet counterpoint to the commodification of land, suggesting that cooperation and sharing remain viable paths toward sustenance. How the first farmers changed human history. To relax sleep too. It begins with the title whispered softly, like a promise. How the first farmers changed human history is not a tale of sudden explosions or violent upheaval. It is a gentle exploration of a long, unfolding story, told at a pace suited to the quiet hours of the night. You settle in, knowing that this narration will trace the subtle pathways that led humanity from roaming bands to rooted communities, from scattered camps to villages and cities. The light is low, the mind is ready to wander slowly through landscapes of distant ages. We begin. Close your eyes or let them rest unfocused and imagine a world at the end of the Ice Age. It is a world of cold winds and vast plains, of animals migrating across open steppes and people following them, carrying what they own on their backs. Fires flicker in the long evenings as groups huddle together, sharing stories of their ancestors. The ground beneath them is familiar, yet transient. They seldom stay in one place for long. The Pleistocene is giving way to the Holocene, and with the gradual warming comes a slow shift in the way humans live. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors hunted and foraged. They moved according to the seasons, collecting nuts and berries, hunting game when it was abundant, and sharing what they had. Their knowledge of the land was intimate and deep. They knew which plants would heal and which could harm, where to find water, when birds would nest and fish would spawn. Their tools were simple but effective: sharp stones, wooden shafts, woven baskets. They shaped their days around the rhythms of the earth, and though their lives were not always easy, they were full of skills honed over countless generations. At times during those long millennia, people paused in certain places for longer than usual. Perhaps a sheltered valley offered plentiful game, or a river provided abundant fish. In these temporary camps, a subtle change began. People noticed that seeds spilled near their shelters sometimes sprouted into new plants. They observed that tubers left in one place would grow again the following year. In the fertile soil of their campsites, a tiny experiment in cultivation began. They were not yet farmers, but the seeds of farming were being sown in their minds. As time went on and climates shifted, these observations would become intentions, and intentions would become traditions. The region known today as the Fertile Crescent curves like a broad smile across parts of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and down toward Egypt. Here, between rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, wild grasses grew in profusion. Small seeds of wheat, barley, and rye were gathered by nimble fingers and stored in baskets. When the Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap that lasted for more than a millennium, ended, the climate warmed and the wild grasses thrived. People living here, often called Natufians, began to build more permanent structures from stone and mud. They had dog companions to help them hunt, and they buried their dead with care. Over generations, they returned to these places, strengthening the ties between people and land. Grinding stones wore smooth as they processed grains into flour. The act of planting seeds intentionally came slowly, perhaps first as a way to ensure favorite plants were close at hand, and later as a deliberate strategy to secure food. The transition was not a single moment, but a gradual learning process spread across centuries. Across the Mediterranean and deep into what is now known as the Middle East, communities began to experiment with raising plants. They selected seeds from the strongest wild grasses, replanted them near their homes, and noticed that the plants that came up were different. Over time, the kernels of wheat and barley grew larger. The heads of the plants became less prone to shatter and scatter their seeds, an evolutionary change guided not by nature alone, but by human hand. Domestication was a dance between human needs and plant adaptations, a slow mutual adjustment that would eventually alter both species profoundly. In East Asia, along the banks of the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, a different but parallel story unfolded. Here, wild rice swayed in marshy wetlands, and early communities learned to collect and process it. Rice is a demanding plant. It needs controlled water levels and careful tending. The people who would become rice, farmers began by encouraging wild stands of rice to grow in places they could reach easily. They learned to flood and drain fields, to transplant seedlings, to weed, and to harvest. The seeds they chose to save were those that held on longer to the stalks, making them easier to gather. Slowly, the grains became plumper and more nutritious. By working with the rice plants, these early cultivators shaped the genetic pathways of a crop that billions of people rely on today. Far to the south in the highlands of New Guinea, people were tending taro, yams, and sugarcane as early as they were in the Fertile Crescent. The landscape here was lush and tropical, with thick forests and mist-filled valleys. The early gardeners cleared small plots, mixing crops together in ways that mimicked the diversity of the forest. They built terraces to manage heavy rains and used stone tools to till the soil. These practices demonstrate that agriculture was not a single invention, but arose independently in different parts of the world, each tailored to local environments and needs. In what is now Mexico and Central America, the ancestors of modern maize was a tall grass known as teosinte. The ears were small and the kernels were hard and enclosed in tough casing. Yet human attention could work wonders. People living in this region, through patient selection and observation, favored plants with larger ears and kernels that were easier to grind and digest. They planted seeds from these plants year after year, slowly transforming teosinte into maize. Alongside maize, they cultivated squash and beans. These three crops, often called the Three Sisters, worked together. Maize provided a structure for beans to climb, beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, and squash sprawled to shade the ground and suppress weeds. This symbiotic planting reflects an understanding of ecology and soil health developed through experience. Across the Andes Mountains, people gathered tubers, roots, and leaves that would become the foundation of a different agricultural tradition. Wild potatoes grew here, small and varied in color and shape. People learned which were edible and how to process them to remove bitter compounds. They began to plant potatoes near their homes, selecting those with desirable traits. They also domesticated quinoa, a seed plant that thrives in cold, high-altitude environments. Llamas and alpacas, relatives of camels, were tamed for wool, meat, and as pack animals. Guinea pigs were kept for food. Agriculture in the Andes was intimately tied to altitude and microclimates, with terraces carved into steep slopes to create arable land. Cold nights were exploited by freeze-drying potatoes into chuño, a preserved food that could be stored for years. In these high valleys, innovation was shaped by necessity and by the challenges of the terrain. If you journeyed to the African continent, you would find still more variations on this theme. In the Sahel, a belt of land stretching across Africa south of the Sahara, people domesticated sorghum and millet, hardy grains that can withstand drought. These grains became staples in diets and supported growing populations. In the forests of West Africa, yams and oil palms were cultivated. In East Africa, people may have independently domesticated cattle known as sanga. Donkeys were tamed in Nubia as early as 5,000 years ago, providing a reliable means of transport. Each crop, each animal, reflected the particular conditions of its home environment and the ingenuity of the people who worked with it. The domestication of animals is a story intertwined with the planting of seeds. Dogs had traveled with humans long before the first fields were sown, accompanying hunters and guarding campsites. The first goats and sheep were likely enticed into human settlements by the promise of food scraps, their numbers gradually controlled and their movements managed. Goats could thrive on shrubs and rough terrain. Sheep provided wool and meat. Pigs, descended from wild boar, were domesticated for their ability to eat almost anything and reproduce quickly. Cattle were tamed from large wild aurochs, providing milk, meat, and muscle. The animal connection brought not only new resources, but also new challenges. Living closely with domesticated animals introduced humans to zoonotic diseases and altered the disease ecology of communities. This relationship would have far-reaching consequences. In the Fertile Crescent, villages grew. People built rectangular houses of mud brick, often with plastered floors and low doorways. Hearths were placed against walls, and storage pits held surplus grain. The community might have a communal structure or courtyard where rituals were held. The smell of smoke mingled with the scent of damp earth. Outside, fields ripened under the sun. Oxen or human hands tilled the soil, and seeds were sown in neat rows. Irrigation channels carried water from rivers to crops. Farming required cooperation. Canals needed maintenance and fairness in distribution. It also required planning. Seeds had to be saved, stored away from moisture and pests. If a family ate their seed grain, there would be nothing to plant the next season. The shift to agriculture changed diets. Hunter-gatherers had eaten a wide variety of plant and animal foods. Early farmers relied more on a few staple crops. The first wheat and barley breads were coarse, ground on stone querns that left grit in the dough. Over time, this wear and tear took a toll on teeth, visible in archaeological remains as grooves and cavities. Evidence from skeletons shows that early farmers were often shorter and had more signs of nutritional stress than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Iron deficiency and dental diseases became common, yet these communities had something previous generations did not: a predictable, though sometimes monotonous, food supply. As villages expanded, so did social complexity. When everyone depended on stored food, rules about ownership and distribution emerged. Land became something to be allocated and defended. Surplus grain could feed people who did not farm. Some individuals devoted their time to making pottery, weaving cloth, or crafting tools. Others became full-time hunters, trading meat for grain. The presence of more people in closer quarters required decisions about leadership and conflict resolution. Kinship ties remained important, but new forms of social organization arose. Religious practices may have become more elaborate, with shrines and rituals focused on ensuring fertility of crops and animals. In the early villages of the Levant, archaeologists have found burials beneath houses. People sometimes interred their dead in the floors, perhaps to keep ancestors close or to mark family property. At the site of Uyun al-Hammam in modern Jordan, researchers uncovered graves where bodies were placed with foxes, hinting at symbolic relationships between humans and animals. At another site, Karaneh 4, a large camp covering several hectares, was occupied by hunter-gatherers 19,000 years ago. The layers of debris indicate repeated use over centuries. Huts were built and rebuilt, and a network of paths connected living spaces. The density of occupation suggests that social complexity and semi-permanent settlement were not exclusive to fully agricultural societies. They foreshadowed what would come. When we speak of a revolution, we often imagine a sudden change. The so-called Neolithic Revolution was not like that. Research has shown that the shift to farming took thousands of years. People oscillated between foraging and cultivation, integrating domesticated crops into wild harvested diets. They maintained flexible strategies, planting when conditions were good, returning to hunting and gathering when they were not. Rather than a single event, agriculture was a process, an accumulation of small decisions and innovations. Some communities may have resisted it, preferring the mobility and diversity of their ancestral ways. Others embraced it, drawn by the promise of surplus and stability. Over time, agriculture spread not because it was inevitably better, but because it allowed certain populations to grow and expand their influence. This spread was not simply a matter of crops and animals moving from one region to another. It involved people, ideas, and genetic heritage. Genetic studies of ancient human remains show that farming did not arrive in Europe as a set of techniques adopted by local hunter-gatherers. Instead, farmers from Anatolia and the Levant migrated westward, bringing their crops, animals, and ways of life. Along the way, they intermingled with the indigenous populations, exchanging genes and knowledge. The resulting populations were a blend of ancestries. As they settled across the continent, new cultural landscapes emerged. In some places, farming spread along coastlines and rivers. In others, it moved over land routes. Differences in climate and soils influenced how these early European farmers adapted their practices. The arrival of domesticated animals also influenced genetic change. Milk from cattle became an important resource in some areas. In early agricultural societies, most adults could not digest lactose. However, a mutation allowing lactose tolerance appeared and spread rapidly among populations that herded cattle. This adaptation is evident in the genetic makeup of many modern Europeans, though it is absent in most East Asian populations where dairy has historically been less important. Such small genetic shifts illustrate how intimately our biology has been shaped by the foods we cultivate and consume. As agriculture spread across Europe, distinctive cultural complexes arose. In Central Europe, the linear ban-ceramic culture left traces of longhouses and linear pottery. Their settlements were often located near rivers and fertile loess soils. They practiced mixed farming, planting wheat and barley, and raising cattle, pigs, and goats. They also made fine decorated pottery and stone tools. In the British Isles, later Neolithic communities built megalithic structures like Stonehenge and New Grange. These monuments were aligned with celestial events, indicating a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. They may have served as ceremonial centers, uniting dispersed farming communities in shared rituals and gatherings. In the Nile Valley, agriculture nourished one of the world's earliest civilizations. Seasonal flooding of the Nile deposited nutrient-rich silt along its banks, creating a narrow strip of fertile land. The predictable rhythm of inundation and the careful management of water through basins and canals allowed farmers to grow wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. They also planted orchards of figs and dates. Grain surpluses supported the rise of centralized authority. Pharaohs oversaw large-scale projects, including the building of pyramids and temples. Scribes developed writing, initially to record grain yields and taxes. Hierarchical social structures formed, with priests and officials at the top and laborers and farmers at the base. Yet at the heart of it all, it was the relationship between people and the river, between farmers and their fields, that sustained the society. Beyond Egypt, in the valleys of the Indus River, a civilization flourished on the basis of agriculture and trade. Settlements like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were carefully planned with grid streets, drainage systems, and granaries. The inhabitants grew barley, wheat, sesame, and peas. They also cultivated cotton, one of the earliest known instances of this plant being spun and woven. Irrigation systems allowed for multiple crops per year. The uniformity of weights and measures found across the region suggests coordinated economic activity. Though the written script of the Indus Valley has not been deciphered, the material remains indicate a society deeply connected to its agricultural base, trading goods with distant regions, and developing craft specializations. In China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River became cradles of agriculture, though with different crops. In the north, millet was planted on dry terraces, and later wheat and barley, borrowed from the west, were cultivated. In the south, rice paddies required complex water management. Terrace slopes mirrored the contours of hillsides, and wooden or bamboo tools aided planting and harvesting. The organization required to maintain paddy fields fostered a sense of community and social cohesion. Over centuries, Chinese farmers developed technologies such as iron plows, water-powered trip hammers, and chain pumps to lift water for irrigation. These innovations increased productivity and supported dense populations. As states formed and expanded, control over agricultural surplus became a source of power. Philosophies and governance structures arose in part in response to the challenges of managing land and people. In the Americas, the rise of maize agriculture supported complex societies. The Olmec civilization along the Gulf Coast is often regarded as a mother culture of Mesoamerica. They built earthen mounds and carved colossal stone heads, their villages surrounded by maize fields. Later, the Maya carved cities from the forests of the Yucatan Peninsula. Their achievements in mathematics and astronomy were underpinned by the ability to produce food surpluses through terracing, irrigation, and the management of forest gardens. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs created chinampas, raised fields built in shallow lake beds. These artificial islands, enriched by lake mud and compost, were highly productive. Crops grown there could be harvested several times a year. The mastery of agricultural techniques allowed Mesoamerican societies to support large urban populations and elaborate ceremonial centers. In the Andean world, agriculture and architecture were intimately linked. The Inca, inheritors of earlier Andean traditions, engineered terrace systems across steep mountainsides. They diverted water through canals carved from stone and built storage warehouses called culcas to hold dried potatoes, maize, and quinoa. The road network they maintained facilitated the movement of goods, troops, and information across an empire that spanned thousands of kilometers. Collective labor, known as maita, organized people to work on state projects, including the upkeep of agricultural terraces. Thus, agriculture shaped the organization of labor and the infrastructure that connected distant regions. As agriculture matured in different regions, it did not remain static. Farmers constantly adapted to new challenges and opportunities. Climate variability could cause droughts or floods, forcing communities to develop irrigation, drainage, and water storage techniques. Soil exhaustion from continuous cropping led to innovations such as crop rotation and the use of manure. People experimented with new crops and varieties, sometimes borrowing from neighbors, sometimes discovering them by chance. Trade networks expanded, carrying not only goods, but also seeds, tools, and ideas. When a novel crop arrived in a region, it could transform diets and economies. For example, the introduction of bananas from Southeast Asia to Africa around 2,000 years ago provided a reliable staple that could be grown in equatorial climates, supporting population growth in parts of the continent. The agricultural way of life also introduced vulnerabilities. Dependence on a few crops meant that a failed harvest could lead to famine. Surplus grain was a blessing in years of plenty, but could attract raiders in times of scarcity. Communities built walls and fortifications to protect their granaries. Inequalities in access to land and food could lead to social tension. Archaeological evidence from some early farming communities shows signs of violence and conflict. Disease spread more easily among denser populations and in proximity to domesticated animals. Tuberculosis, measles, and influenza are thought to have jumped from animals to humans in agricultural settings. These diseases would later have profound impacts when populations with no immunity came into contact with them. Long before modern industrial agriculture, farmers recognized the need to steward their land. Techniques such as terrace building, controlled burns, and fallowing were developed to maintain soil fertility. In some areas, forest gardening created productive landscapes that combined trees, shrubs, vines, and herbs in a sustainable mosaic. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, indigenous peoples practiced fire stick farming, using controlled burns to manage forests and encourage the growth of edible plants. In the eastern woodlands, a suite of domesticated plants known as the Eastern Agricultural Complex included goosefoot, sunflowers, squash, and sumpweed. These practices show that agriculture can take many forms, from intensively cultivated fields to semi-managed wild landscapes. The story of our species before farming is rich and textured. Early humans were not aimless wanderers, but practiced in reading the signs of their environments. They moved through forests and across grasslands with purpose, guided by memory and seasonal patterns. The men and women who painted bison and horses on the walls of caves like Chauvet and Lascaux were keen observers of animal behavior. Their art captured movement, musculature, and spirit. They understood the tracks of antelope, the habits of birds, and the cycles of plants. Families slept under rock overhangs or in skin tents, sharing warmth and stories. Children learned by watching, imitating their elders as they knapped flint or dug roots. Bands shared food communally. Reciprocity ensured survival. Conflict occurred, but cooperation was essential. These societies had social norms, beliefs, and rituals. They created ornaments from shells and bones, burying their dead with care. They developed languages rich with nuance. Their world was animated with meaning, each landscape feature connected to ancestral tales. This deep engagement with land laid the groundwork for eventual cultivation, for it fostered an understanding of cycles and growth. As the climate warmed after the last ice age, humans encountered new ecological niches. Rivers that had been braided with ice melt settled into predictable channels. Forests expanded, and grasslands retreated in some places. The abundance of certain species changed. People responded by experimenting with plant management. In areas where wild stands of grain ripened simultaneously, groups returned repeatedly, building temporary structures and storing harvests in pits lined with stone. They began to invent tools specifically for harvesting. Flint sickle blades set into wooden handles and hafted with bitumen. Grinding stones and mortars became household staples. Roasting pits were lined with clay to make them more durable. New forms of baskets and storage jars evolved to keep grain safe from moisture and rodents. These innovations hint at the cognitive shift from immediate consumption to planning for the future. Among the earliest known settlements is the site of Jericho near the Jordan River. By around 10,000 years ago, people there built a massive stone tower and a thick wall long before pottery was developed. The purpose of the tower has been debated, Perhaps it served defensive functions, marked the passage of time with its shadow, or symbolized communal effort. The wall may have protected against floods or symbolized the boundary of the community. People in Jericho cultivated barley and emmer wheat, tended goats, and collected wild plants. They buried their dead beneath their houses and sometimes removed and modeled skulls with plaster, painting eyes and hair to create lifelike faces. These practices suggest a complex spiritual life and a deep connection to lineage and place. Their mud brick houses formed a tight cluster, with roofs serving as streets and entries from above. Living in such proximity required negotiation and social rules. Further north in central Anatolia, the settlement of Çatalhöyük flourished around 7,500 years ago. Its inhabitants lived in closely packed mud brick homes without streets. They moved along rooftops and entered through ceiling hatches. Interiors were plastered white and decorated with murals depicting hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and the horns of bulls. Reliefs of leopards and vultures adorned walls. People planted wheat, barley, and peas, and herded sheep and goats. They traded obsidian from volcanic sources for shells and other goods. Burials under floors maintained connections between generations. The community had shrines with platforms perhaps used for ritual feasting. Çatalhöyük demonstrates that early farming communities could be large and egalitarian, with no clear evidence of social stratification. Households seem to have been relatively equal in size and wealth, suggesting cooperative management of resources. In southeastern Anatolia stands the enigmatic site of Göbekli Tepe, dating back over 11,000 years. Though not a farming village, its presence challenges our understanding of the sequence of events leading to agriculture. At Göbekli Tepe, tall T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing many tons, are arranged in circles. The pillars are carved with images of animals, foxes, snakes, cranes, lions, rendered with a precision and artistry remarkable for their age. Archaeologists believe the site was used for ritual gatherings. Its construction would have required coordination of large groups, indicating social complexity. Some scholars argue that the need to organize such gatherings may have spurred the development of farming to feed participants. If so, ritual and belief could have been catalysts for cultivation, reversing the assumption that surplus must precede ceremony. In any case, Göbekli Tepe shows that complex symbolic behavior predated full sedentism and agriculture. Turning to East Asia, we can linger among the villages of the Yangshao culture, which flourished along the Yellow River around 6,000 years ago. The people of Yangshao cultivated millet, raised pigs and dogs, and lived in semi-subterranean houses with thatched roofs. Their pottery was painted with red and black designs, spirals, fish, human figures. They wore clothes woven from hemp and raised silkworms for silk. Cemeteries excavated at Yangshao sites reveal organized layouts with graves containing pottery, tools, and ornaments. This suggests an awareness of status differences, though not extreme inequality. Children were often buried with fewer goods than adults, hinting at age-based distinctions. The Yangshao people also developed kilns to fire their pottery and made tools from polished stone and bone. Their agricultural calendar was marked by communal activities, including house building, planting, and harvesting festivals. Further east and south, in the valleys that cradle rice paddies, the Majia Bang and Hemudu cultures thrived. Early paddy fields discovered at Hemudu, dated to around 7,000 years ago, show that people built raised wooden walkways above flooded plots and used tools of bone and shell to transplant rice seedlings. They domesticated water buffalo, which later became integral to plowing. Their houses were built on stilts above waterlogged ground, protecting them from floods and pests. Artifacts include wooden bowls, musical instruments, and ornaments carved from bone and ivory. Seed husks and plant remains recovered from these sites reveal a diet that combined rice with acorns, water chestnuts, and fish. The diversity of food suggests that early rice farmers maintained a broad spectrum of subsistence activities while focusing increasingly on cultivation. Traveling to New Guinea, we find evidence of agricultural experimentation as early as 9,000 years ago at Cook Swamp in the highlands. Here, people drained swamps with ditches and planted crops such as taro, yams, bananas, and sugarcane. The soil is acidic, requiring careful management. Raised beds and drainage channels helped maintain fertility and control water. Stone tools found at the site show polish consistent with digging. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of wooden stake holes, indicating that crops were staked and supported. The agriculture practiced here was more horticulture than extensive field cropping, characterized by an intimate relationship with the surrounding forest. Crops were interplanted with trees and shrubs, creating multi-layered gardens. Social organization in these highlands was based on kinship groups that exchanged goods and services through complex systems of reciprocity, including ceremonial pig feasts. These feasts reinforced alliances and redistributed surplus, illustrating how food could serve social as well as nutritional needs. In the tropical lowlands of Central America, early farmers cultivated not only maize, but also a wide variety of fruits and spices. Chili peppers, domesticated in Mexico as early as 6,000 years ago, added heat and flavor to dishes. Cacao beans, prized for their rich taste, were fermented, dried, and ground into a paste used in ceremonial drinks. Vanilla orchids were cultivated for their aromatic pods. Cotton, spun and woven into cloth, provided material for clothing and trade. The interplay of these crops contributed to a diverse cuisine and economy. Early villages, such as those at San Andres and La Venta, show evidence of elevated mounds that may have supported communal buildings. Shell ornaments, jade figurines, and finely worked obsidian found in graves reveal far-reaching trade networks. The domestication of bees for honey, the use of gourds as containers, and the practice of milpa agriculture reflect a sophisticated understanding of plant ecology. Rituals involving ball courts, offerings, and calendrical ceremonies tied agricultural cycles to social and religious life. High in the Andes, before the rise of the Inca, the Norte Chico civilization emerged along the arid coast of Peru over 5,000 years ago. Surrounded by desert, these communities relied on both farming and fishing. They grew cotton, gourds, and beans in river valleys, using simple irrigation to water their crops. Cotton was essential for making fishing nets, which allowed them to harvest abundant anchovies from the sea. Their cities, like Corral, featured pyramidal structures, sunken plazas, and musical instruments made from animal bones. Intriguingly, they left no evidence of pottery. Instead, they used gourds and baskets. The Norte Chico people demonstrate that significant urban development could occur without ceramics, writing, or warfare, sustained by a combination of agriculture and maritime resources. Their social organization appears to have been cooperative, with centralized projects carried out through communal labor. This early Andean civilization set the stage for later societies that would blend highland and coastal resources. Agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa shows both independent domestications and the adoption of crops from elsewhere. African rice, Oryza glaberrima, was domesticated in the inland delta of the Niger River. It is adapted to flood-prone environments and has genetic traits distinct from Asian rice. The cultivation of sorghum and pearl millet in the Sahel provided reliable staples in semi-arid regions. These grains can grow in poor soils and withstand dry conditions. In West Africa, oil palms supplied cooking oil, and kola nuts were valued for their stimulant properties and used in rituals. Enset, or false banana, was domesticated in Ethiopia, its starchy pseudostem fermented to create a staple known as kocho. The domestication of donkeys in Nubia facilitated long-distance trade across deserts, linking sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt and the Mediterranean. Cultural traditions such as the Bantu migrations, which spread agriculture and ironworking throughout much of Africa, beginning around 3,000 years ago, illustrate how the movement of people and crops shaped linguistic and cultural landscapes. As Bantu-speaking peoples moved south and east, they carried with them yams, bananas, and knowledge of farming, mixing with local hunter-gatherers and absorbing local crops like finger millet. Domesticated animals deserve their own quiet consideration. The dog, likely the first animal to join human camps, appears in the archaeological record as early as 15,000 years ago. Initially, wolves may have approached human camps to scavenge leftover meat. Humans tolerated the bolder, less aggressive animals, and over generations, a mutualistic relationship formed. Dogs offered protection, alerted to danger, and assisted in hunting. They also provided companionship. Genetic evidence shows that dogs diversified early, forming distinct lineages in different regions. Goats and sheep were domesticated in the Zagros Mountains and central Anatolia. They offered not just meat, but milk, wool, and hides. Selective breeding led to animals that produced more wool or milk and were more docile. Pigs, domesticated both in eastern Anatolia and in East Asia, were valued for their ability to convert scraps into meat. They thrived around human settlements and reproduced quickly. Cattle, domesticated from wild oryx, became powerful work animals. Their strength allowed for plowing, which opened up heavier soils to cultivation. Horses joined humans on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, enabling faster travel and eventually changing warfare. Camels, domesticated on the Arabian Peninsula and in Central Asia, turned deserts into trade routes. Donkeys provided steady endurance for transport. Each animal altered human possibilities, shaping migration, trade, and agriculture itself. With animals came new skills and responsibilities. People learned to herd, to build pens and enclosures, to care for sick animals, and assist in births. They developed techniques for milking and dairying. Cheese and yogurt extended the shelf life of milk and made it digestible for those lacking lactose tolerance. Sheep shearing and spinning wool created textiles. The presence of animals influenced settlement patterns. Pastures were needed for grazing, and seasonal movements sometimes continued as pastoralism. In some regions, such as Central Asia, pastoral nomadism became a way of life, with clans moving livestock across steppe grasslands according to the seasons. These herders interacted with agricultural communities through trade, exchanging meat and animal products for grain and metal. The relationship between farmers and herders could be symbiotic or tense, depending on resource pressures and cultural attitudes. The advent of agriculture altered social structures. Among hunter-gatherers, social status was often flexible based on personal qualities like skill, generosity, and wisdom. Leadership was situational and temporary. With farming, property in the form of land, livestock, and stored grain became central. Inheritance systems developed to pass property to offspring. In many societies, patrilineal descent and male inheritance became common, though matrilineal systems persisted in others. Gender roles shifted. While women in hunter-gatherer groups had significant autonomy, the demands of plowing and heavy field labor often increased the emphasis on male labor in farming communities. Women, however, remained central to seed selection, weeding, and household management. The burden of carrying water, processing grain, and caring for children and animals fell heavily on women. These roles were complex and varied across cultures. Archaeological evidence of differences in grave goods, burial locations, and skeletal markers of labor suggests that social stratification appeared in some farming societies, but not in all. Some remained egalitarian for millennia. Others developed hierarchies with elites controlling surplus and labor. With surplus food and sedentary life came the rise of institutions. Temples emerged as centers of economic as well as spiritual life. In Sumer, temples stored grain collected as taxes or offerings. Priest kings oversaw irrigation systems and coordinated labor for maintenance and construction. Records on clay tablets tracked contributions and distributions. In Egypt, pharaohs were seen as divine mediators ensuring the annual flood and agricultural fertility. Tombs filled with goods for the afterlife attest to beliefs linking prosperity in this life with the next. In Mesoamerica, rulers were often expected to perform rituals ensuring maize growth. Calendrical knowledge was a form of power. These institutions formalized the relationship between farming and governance, making the control of food a political tool. The health implications of agriculture are visible in ancient bones and teeth. Skeletal remains of early farmers often show signs of chronic stress and degenerative joint disease. The repetitive motions of grinding grain and hoeing fields left marks on vertebrae and joints. Bones display evidence of iron deficiency anemia, likely related to diets high in cereals but low in meat. Teeth show cavities and wear patterns from grit in bread. Enamel hypoplasia lines on teeth indicates episodes of malnutrition or illness during childhood. In some early farming communities, average life expectancy decreased compared to their foraging ancestors. Settled life also exposed people to contaminated water sources and animal waste, increasing the incidence of gastrointestinal diseases. Epidemic diseases measles, smallpox, influenza emerged and spread in dense populations. Close proximity to domesticated animals provided the pathogens with reservoirs to evolve and jump to humans. Conversely, agricultural life enabled larger families, and while infant mortality may have been high, the potential for population growth increased. Farming profoundly affected the environment. Forests were cleared for fields, leading to habitat loss and changes in local climates. In the Fertile Crescent, millennia of irrigation and cultivation eventually contributed to salinization of soils, reducing fertility. In some places, terrace systems and careful water management prevented erosion. In others, overgrazing and deforestation led to gullying and desertification. The Sahara itself expanded as climate shifts and human activities combined. In Europe, the spread of plowing and grazing transformed once wooded landscapes into patchwork fields and pastures. Soil erosion occurred where slopes were plowed without terraces. By the Roman period, deforestation in the Mediterranean basin was pronounced. Timber was used for ships, buildings, and fuel. The plow allowed deeper soils to be turned, but also exposed them to wind and rain. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s in North America is a modern reminder of how plowing prairie grasses without consideration of their ecological role can lead to catastrophic soil loss. These environmental histories remind us that farming is an interaction with living systems, requiring care and wisdom. Agriculture is intertwined with mythology and ritual across cultures. In India, the festival of Pongal celebrates the harvest with rice boiled in milk and jaggery until it overflows, symbolizing abundance. In ancient Egypt, the festival of Opet linked the pharaoh's renewal with the flooding of the Nile. In Yoruba tradition, the deity Orisha Oko presides over agriculture and fertility, receiving sacrifices and dances to ensure a bountiful harvest. In the Andean region, Pachamama, Mother Earth, is honored with offerings of coca leaves and chicha, asking for her blessing on crops. These rituals are not merely superstition. They express gratitude, reinforce communal bonds, and encode agricultural knowledge. They remind participants of the dependence of human life on forces beyond their control. They also serve as a means of transmitting cultural values and ethical relationships with the earth. Songs sung during planting and harvest often contain instructions about timing and technique, woven into melodies that ease the work and help coordinate communal efforts. The spread of agriculture facilitated the spread of languages and cultures. As Bantu-speaking farmers moved across Africa, they carried with them words for yams, sorghum, and goats, intertwining language with agricultural practices. The Austronesian expansion from Taiwan through the Philippines and into the Pacific brought taro, pigs, chickens, and the technology of outrigger canoes to remote islands. These sailors cultivated crops on volcanic soils and developed ingenious systems to collect and store rainwater. Indo-European migrations, possibly linked to early pastoralists on the steppe, spread languages and domesticated horses into Europe and South Asia. In each case, the movement of people was propelled or supported by agricultural skills and resources. These expansions often involved interaction with existing populations, leading to admixture and cultural synthesis. Evidence from genetics and linguistics paints a picture of continual movement and exchange, rather than isolated development. Writing and counting systems evolved alongside the need to track agricultural production. Before cuneiform, Sumerians used clay tokens of various shapes to represent quantities of goods cones for measures of grain, spheres for head of sheep. These tokens were sealed in clay envelopes, or bullae, with impressions on the outside indicating the contents. Eventually, the impressions themselves evolved into signs pressed into tablets, eliminating the need for tokens. Complex administrative systems developed in temple economies, where scribes recorded deliveries of barley and distributions of beer. In Egypt, hieroglyphic inscriptions on tomb walls depict scenes of plowing, sowing, and harvesting, accompanied by hieratic script noting quantities. In China, oracle bone inscriptions mention offerings of millet and rice. The Maya used glyphs to record tribute of maize and cacao. These records show not only quantities, but also the obligation of individuals and communities to contribute to state or temple stores. Mathematics itself, with its place value systems and ability to manipulate large numbers, owes much to the need to measure fields, tally harvests, and plan irrigation. Later, agricultural innovations built upon the legacy of the first farmers. In the Bronze Age, the invention of the wheel allowed for carts that could transport goods more efficiently. The yoke harness, improved over time, enabled oxen and horses to pull heavier loads. Chariots, initially used for hunting and display, became instruments of war that allowed states with strong agricultural bases to project power. Iron smelting produced tools that were stronger and more durable than bronze. In medieval China, innovations like the seed drill improved planting efficiency, while the development of windmills in Europe harnessed new sources of power. The introduction of the horse collar in Europe allowed horses to pull plows without choking, increasing speed and efficiency. Each technological advance was rooted in the human desire to manage land and resources with less labor and more reliability. The cumulative effect of these innovations was a steady increase in the ability of societies to produce food and support larger populations. Climate fluctuations have been constant companions to agricultural societies. The 8.2 kilo-year event, a sudden cooling caused by meltwater from glacial lakes, led some communities to adapt by diversifying crops or intensifying irrigation. The Holocene climatic optimum, a period of warmer and wetter conditions, allowed for the northward expansion of agriculture in Europe and Asia. Later, the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures and shorter growing seasons to parts of the northern hemisphere, contributing to crop failures and social upheavals. Drought cycles, such as those associated with the El Niño Southern Oscillation, have affected monsoon patterns and river flows, challenging farmers in tropical and subtropical regions. Throughout, human societies adjusted by storing surplus, altering planting dates, switching crops, or migrating. Archaeological evidence of abandoned fields and relocated settlements speaks to the resilience and vulnerability of agricultural communities. Recognizing the links between climate and food reinforces the importance of flexibility and foresight. The culture of farming includes intangible heritage songs, stories, and sayings passed down through generations. In the Scottish Highlands, walking songs accompanied the rhythmic beating of cloth, but there were also songs for grinding grain and milking cows. In India, proverbs about rain and plowing guide farmers in their decisions: plow in May and you will not want hay. In Japan, the festival of Tanabata includes poems tying together stars and rice harvests. Across Africa, storytelling during communal work sessions weaves moral lessons with humor. In many cultures, lullabies reference cows, goats, and fields, soothing children with images of agricultural life. These verbal traditions encode ecological knowledge: when to expect rain, how to recognize soil fertility, and foster a sense of continuity. To listen to them is to hear the voices of ancestors guiding present actions. They remind us that agriculture is as much about culture as it is about cultivation. The movement of agricultural peoples reshaped the genetic landscape of humanity. In Europe, the arrival of Anatolian farmers introduced new lineages, blending with hunter-gatherers. Later, steppe pastoralists associated with the Yamnaya culture brought genes linked to lactose tolerance and perhaps Indo-European languages. In South Asia, gene flow from Iranian farmers mixed with local groups to form the genetic basis of many modern populations. In the Americas, the spread of maize agriculture into the North American woodlands was accompanied by cultural adoption rather than massive migration. The dispersal of Austronesian-speaking peoples across the Pacific left traces of their genomes in Polynesian, Micronesian, and Malagasy peoples. These genetic stories underline that agriculture was not simply a technique, but a demographic force driving interactions among populations, shaping who we are today. Beyond the Second Agricultural Revolution, which introduced crop rotation and improved animal breeding in the 17th and 18th centuries, the 20th century's Green Revolution dramatically increased yields through high-yielding varieties of wheat and rice, along with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. These advances averted famines in many parts of the world and allowed global populations to surge. Yet they also led to monocultures, dependence on chemical inputs, and the loss of local crop varieties. Water tables fell as irrigation expanded. Pesticides harmed beneficial insects. Smallholders sometimes found themselves marginalized by large agribusiness. In response, movements advocating sustainable agriculture, organic farming, and permaculture emerged. Seed savers began preserving heirloom varieties. Indigenous knowledge was recognized for its importance in biodiversity conservation. Urban gardens, community-supported agriculture, and farmers markets reconnected consumers with the land. These contemporary trends reflect a return to principles visible among the first farmers: diversity, resilience, and respect for ecological cycles. Agriculture's influence extends into realms like art and philosophy. Many classical philosophies arose in agrarian contexts. Confucius emphasized order and hierarchy, reflecting the structured life of agricultural communities. Greek philosophers debated the ideal balance between leisure and labor, leisure made possible by food surpluses. Pastoral poetry romanticized the countryside, idealizing shepherds and plowmen. Visual art depicted harvesting, planting, and rural life, sometimes as symbols of virtue or the natural order. Musicians and composers drew inspiration from seasonal rhythms and folk melodies rooted in agricultural work. Even in contemporary literature, the farm remains a potent symbol of stability and tradition, of struggle and endurance, of the relationship between humanity and nature. The interplay between agriculture and migration has been dynamic. When soils became exhausted or populations grew too large for local resources, families or entire communities would move. Sometimes they sought new land to cultivate, sometimes they were drawn by opportunities elsewhere. The push and pull of agricultural potential guided migrations across continents. The steppe pastoralists moved with their herds in search of fresh pastures. Island settlers in the Pacific carried bundles of taro shoots and piglets in their canoes, ensuring their agricultural life could be transplanted. Migrants maintained core practices while adapting to new conditions, blending their traditions with those of their neighbors. This continuous movement created a mosaic of cultures, each rooted in the need to grow food, but shaped by specific environments. Water management has always been central to farming. From the qanats of Persia underground channels tapping groundwater and conveying it to arid fields to the intricate floating gardens of Xochimilco in Mexico, humans have channeled, stored, and lifted water to nurture crops. Roman aqueducts carried water over long distances, while the Chinampas of Mesoamerica created self-irrigating raised fields. In Bali, the Subak system of shared irrigation linked farmers in networks of cooperation governed by temples dedicated to the water goddess Dewi Danu. In Africa's Sahel, stone lines slowed runoff and increased moisture penetration into the soil. Water's importance extends beyond physical sustenance. Many religions see rivers and springs as sacred. The Ganges, the Nile, the Tigris, and the Mekong are not just waterways but lifelines woven into cosmology and daily practice. The rise of cities, too, stems from agriculture. Urban centers like Uruk in Mesopotamia, Memphis in Egypt, and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley grew from villages once sustained by nearby fields. As populations concentrated, food had to be brought from further afield, necessitating administrative structures and transportation. Markets emerged as hubs for exchanging surplus. Craftsmen, scribes, and priests depended on farmers. Walls protected granaries and storehouses. In the Andes, Cusco served as the heart of an empire anchored in far-flung fields. In Mesoamerica, Tenochtitlan rose on an island in a lake, supplied by Chinampas and tribute from conquered territories. Urban agriculture sometimes persisted within city walls, rooftop gardens, backyard plots, and communal fields providing fresh produce. The relationship between city and countryside has always been symbiotic, a balance of production and consumption. Even as agriculture spread, pockets of hunting and gathering persisted. Sometimes these foragers existed alongside farmers, trading meat, honey, and forest products for grain and pottery. In other instances, they retreated to marginal lands where farming was difficult. Some groups, like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of Southern Africa, continue to practice foraging today, although their territories have been encroached upon. Their knowledge of wild plants and animals remains profound, offering insights into sustainable living. The coexistence of foraging and farming underscores that the adoption of agriculture was not universal nor uniformly embraced. It highlights human diversity in subsistence strategies and reminds us that progress is not a single path, but a mosaic of choices. Many traditional farming systems are models of ecological balance. In the Philippines, rice terraces on the island of Luzon have been tended for 2 millennia. They follow the contours of mountains, held in place by stone walls and irrigated by streams diverted with bamboo pipes. The terraces create microclimates where fish and ducks can coexist with rice. The maintenance of terraces is a communal responsibility, passed down through generations. In the Mediterranean, the Dehesa system integrates oak trees with pasture and crops, supporting livestock and biodiversity. In Ethiopia, home gardens around houses blend coffee, fruit trees, vegetables, and medicinal plants. These polycultures resist pests and diseases better than monocultures. Observing such systems reveals principles of diversity, integration, and long-term stewardship principles that echo the wisdom of the first farmers. The agricultural calendar shapes time itself. Festivals mark solstices and equinoxes, planting and harvest. Calendars as varied as the Maya long count and the Roman agrarian festival schedule illustrate how deeply agriculture informs our reckoning of days. Names of months like September, October, November, and December derive from numbers that once aligned with harvesting, months before calendar reforms shifted their positions. The very word holiday originates from holy day, many of which were tied to agricultural events. When you count down to the weekend, you participate in a rhythm that descends from older cycles of work and rest. While modern life has introduced artificial lights and climate control that blur seasons, agricultural rhythms still shape many cultural practices, school vacations, fiscal years, and even storytelling traditions that begin with planting or harvest. The laws that govern societies often reflect agricultural priorities. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a basalt stele around 1750 BCE, includes provisions on irrigation and farming. It specifies penalties for neglecting dikes and rules for leasing fields. Roman law codified property rights and inheritance of land. In medieval Europe, manorial systems tied peasants to land, with obligations to work the lord's fields. Land reforms, revolutions, and uprisings often centered around control of land and food. In modern times, debates over subsidies, trade tariffs, and genetically modified organisms continue the tradition of agriculture being a political matter. Policies on water rights, land use, and environmental protection are deeply rooted in the need to balance production with sustainability. Recognizing agriculture's centrality to law and governance underscores its role in structuring human society. As we consider the future, we can draw lessons from the first farmers. They experimented, observed, and adapted. They valued diversity of crops and resilience. They understood the importance of community cooperation in managing resources like water and soil. Their rituals and stories connected them to the land and to each other. Today, we face challenges of climate change, population growth, and environmental degradation. Sustainable agriculture, whether through organic methods, regenerative practices, or agroecology, echoes the principles of our ancestors. It emphasizes soil health, biodiversity, and social equity. Seed banks and community gardens safeguard genetic diversity. Movements for food sovereignty advocate for the rights of people to define their own food systems, honoring local knowledge and traditions. These efforts remind us that the story of agriculture is ongoing. It is not a completed chapter, but a living narrative in which each of us participates through the choices we make about what to eat, what to grow, and how to care for the land. Throughout history, myths and stories have woven agriculture into the fabric of culture. In ancient Greece, Demeter was the goddess of the harvest, her grief in winter giving way to the joy of spring. In Mesopotamia, the tale of Dumuzi and Inanna speaks of cycles of fertility and dormancy. In China, the mythical figure Shennong taught people the use of herbs and is credited with the discovery of agriculture. These narratives reflect the deep dependence people had on their crops and the sense of mystery and reverence surrounding the growing of food. Rituals and festivals were timed to planting and harvest, expressing gratitude and hope. Agricultural cycles became metaphors for life, death, and renewal. In different parts of the world, distinct early settlements illustrate the diversity of agricultural beginnings. On the Laos Plateau of northern China, the Banpo site reveals a village surrounded by a moat with round and square houses built of mud and wood. Inside, hearths were set slightly off-center and storage pits were dug into the floors. The people of Banpo cultivated millet and raised pigs and dogs. They spun hemp into thread and molded clay into bowls decorated with fish motifs. Burials at Banpo show that some individuals wore necklaces of bone or stone beads, perhaps indicating social or ritual status. The arrangement of graves suggests the importance of family and clan ties. The site gives us a snapshot of a community balancing foraging and farming, living on the cusp of change. In the Indus Valley, before the rise of cities like Mohenjo-Daro, the settlement of Mehrgar blossomed on the Kachi Plain. Beginning more than 9,000 years ago, people here cultivated barley and wheat, raised sheep, goats, and zebu cattle, and hunted local wildlife. They lived in mud brick houses that evolved from simple square structures to more complex arrangements with multiple rooms. Mehrgar is also notable for evidence of early dentistry. Archaeologists have found skulls with drilled molars, suggesting treatment of dental pain. Beads made from lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian indicate long-distance trade. By the time the Indus cities emerged, these early farmers had built a foundation of agricultural knowledge that would support urbanization. The Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia, preceding the rise of Sumer, offers another chapter. Villages like Eridu featured temples with buttressed walls and altars indicating organized religious practice alongside farming. The Ubaid people cultivated barley and dates, fished in marshes, and herded sheep and cattle. Their painted pottery green, brown, and black designs on buff clay gives glimpses of aesthetic sensibilities. As Ubaid settlements grew and merged, they paved the way for the later city-states of Uruk and Ur. These early communities experimented with irrigation, digging canals and channels to bring water to fields. Cooperation in managing water resources likely fostered social cohesion and hierarchy. The domestication of plants went beyond staples. Sugarcane, for instance, was first cultivated in New Guinea around 8,000 years ago. Its sweet juice made it a prized crop. From the island, sugarcane spread to Southeast Asia and India, where people learned to boil the juice into crystals. Bananas, domesticated in Southeast Asia, provided a starchy food that required little processing. Plantains became staples in Africa after introduction through trade. In South America, cassava, a woody shrub native to the Amazon, was domesticated. Its tubers contain cyanogenic glycosides and must be processed through grating, pressing, and cooking to remove toxins. The development of such processing techniques indicates a deepening knowledge of plant chemistry and a willingness to invest labor for caloric gain. These crops expanded the range of environments in which agriculture could thrive, allowing farming to spread into humid tropics and equatorial forests. Trade emerged as an extension of agriculture. Once communities produced more than they needed, they exchanged surplus for items not available locally. In Mesopotamia, barley became a unit of exchange and was sometimes used to pay workers. Beer, brewed from barley, served as wages for laborers building ziggurats. Obsidian from Anatolia was traded for shell from the Persian Gulf and ivory from the Indus Valley. In the Mediterranean, olive oil and wine traveled in amphorae, while in China, silk and lacquerware moved along routes that later formed part of the Silk Road. Salt, essential for preserving food, was mined or evaporated and carried over long distances. Markets became social spaces where people met, news traveled, marriages were arranged, and festivals were held. The exchanges were not purely economic, they wove together cultures and created networks that bound distant regions. Conflict, too, was influenced by agriculture. Settled communities accumulated resources that could be raided. Food surpluses could support warriors and kings. The first fortified settlements appeared in places like the Iberian Peninsula, where hill forts offered protection for grain stores and livestock. In Mesopotamia, city-states fought over water rights and arable land. Walls around cities like Uruk served to protect citizens and their granaries. The development of bronze weapons and chariots was tied to societies with the surplus to support metalworkers and warriors. In China, the Warring States period saw armies conscripted from agricultural populations and supplied by granaries. Yet, war could also be a catalyst for technological innovation and administrative reform. The interplay between conflict and agriculture underscores the dual nature of surplus as both blessing and temptation. Religion and farming have been intertwined from the beginning. Agricultural societies often developed pantheons centered on fertility and seasons. The Sumerians revered Inanna as the goddess of love and war, but also as a deity linked to the storehouse and the date palm. In ancient Canaan, Baal was a rain god whose defeat by the forces of death and his return each year symbolized the dry and rainy seasons. The Roman festival of Saturnalia celebrated Saturn, god of seed and sowing, with feasts and role reversals. In Southeast Asia, rice goddess figures like Dewi Sri in Indonesia and May Phosop in Thailand were honored with offerings before planting and after harvest. These deities embody the uncertainties of farming, the dependence on factors beyond human control, and the hope that rituals can influence outcomes. Agricultural temples, whether pyramids or simple altars, served as focal points for community gatherings, reinforcing shared values and beliefs. Timekeeping and observation of celestial cycles were essential for agriculture. Megalithic structures like Stonehenge in England, Nabta Playa in Egypt, and the Sun Dagger on Fajada Butte in the American Southwest align with solstices or equinoxes, marking times to plant or harvest. Farmers watched the stars. The appearance of the Pleiades in the night sky often signaled the beginning of planting in Greece. Sirius rising heralded the Nile flood. Shadows cast by standing stones or gnomons indicated the sun's height, helping to determine seasons. Lunar calendars, based on the cycles of the moon, guided rice farming in East Asia, timing the transplanting of seedlings and the management of water. Over generations, this observational knowledge was codified in almanacs and perpetuated through oral tradition. The blending of astronomy and agriculture attests to the curiosity and precision of early observers. Music, art, and craft blossomed alongside farming. Pottery, initially utilitarian, evolved into an art form. The shapes, patterns, and pigments on pots tell stories of cultural identity. In Japan's Jomon culture, deep pots with cord-marked patterns became signatures of a hunter-gatherer society that gradually adopted horticulture. Later, Yayoi pottery, simpler and more functional, reflected a focus on rice agriculture. In the Near East, painted pottery depicted grain stalks, domesticated animals, and farming tools. Textile patterns often drew from agricultural motifs, stalks, vines, and animal tracks. Weaving itself, dependent on fibers from flax, cotton, wool, or silk, was made possible by agriculture. The rhythms of spinning and weaving accompanied conversations and songs. Instruments like flutes carved from bone or wood played music that echoed across fields, perhaps to coordinate labor or celebrate harvests. The arts enriched the sensory landscape of agricultural societies, adding beauty to the necessary work of sustenance. Fermentation represented an important innovation in food processing. Beer brewed from barley in Mesopotamia, wine from grapes in the Levant and Mediterranean, rice wine in China, and chicha from maize in the Andes, all emerged from the discovery that grains and fruits left to sit would transform into effervescent liquids. Yogurt and cheese transformed milk into products that could be stored longer and digested by people who lacked lactose tolerance. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickles preserved vegetables through the lean months. Fermented fish sauces added protein and flavor. These foods not only extended shelf life, but also enriched diets with probiotics and vitamins. The social role of shared drinking and feasting cannot be understated. Communal consumption reinforced bonds and allowed for rituals of hospitality. The science of fermentation is rooted in observation and experiment, hallmarks of agricultural societies' ingenuity. Agricultural societies experienced environmental crises that tested their resilience. Around 4,200 years ago, a severe drought affected regions from the Mediterranean to South Asia. This event has been linked to the decline of the Old Kingdom in Egypt and disruptions in the Indus Valley civilization. In the Mediterranean Bronze Age, a combination of drought, earthquakes, and invasion led to the collapse of several palace economies. These crises highlight the vulnerability of societies dependent on intensive agriculture, particularly when monocultures or centralized systems fail to adapt. Conversely, the survival of smaller, more diversified communities suggests that flexibility and local knowledge can buffer against climate variability. Such patterns are echoed in modern times when globalized food systems, while efficient, may lack resilience to shocks. Modern agriculture is exploring new frontiers, drawing inspiration from ancient practices and cutting-edge technology. Vertical farms stack hydroponic systems in urban warehouses, using LED lights to grow leafy greens year-round with minimal water. Aquaponics combines fish farming with plant cultivation, creating closed-loop systems that recycle nutrients. Crop scientists are reviving ancient grains like quinoa, amaranth, and teff, recognizing their nutritional value and adaptability. Geneticists sequence the genomes of crops to identify traits for drought tolerance, disease resistance, and improved nutrition. At the same time, indigenous farmers continue to cultivate traditional varieties, preserving genetic diversity. Seed banks like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault store seeds from around the world to safeguard against loss. Community seed exchanges allow farmers to share and preserve local varieties. These initiatives echo the careful seed saving practiced by the first farmers, updated for a global age. Colonization and agriculture are intertwined in complicated ways. Europeans arriving in the Americas introduced wheat, barley, and cattle, transforming landscapes and diets. They also imposed land tenure systems that displaced indigenous peoples and undermined traditional agricultural practices. Plantations grew sugar, cotton, and tobacco using enslaved labor, generating wealth for colonizers and misery for the enslaved. In Africa, colonial powers promoted cash crops like cocoa and coffee, often at the expense of local food production. The consequences of these systems persist in global inequalities. Yet the resilience of indigenous agriculture has endured. Many indigenous communities are reclaiming ancestral practices, revitalizing native crops, and asserting sovereignty over their food systems. These efforts are part of a broader movement to decolonize agriculture and restore equitable relationships with the land. Gender and family life in farming communities were complex and varied. In many early societies, women managed gardens, selected seeds, and processed grain, while men plowed fields and herded animals. Women's knowledge of plants, soils, and weather was passed down through generations. In parts of West Africa, women controlled rice fields and held economic power through the sale of surplus grain. Among the Iroquois in North America, women farmed the fields and owned the longhouses. They also had a voice in council decisions. In contrast, some patriarchal societies limited women's ownership of land and their legal rights. Family structures ranged from extended households with multiple generations under one roof to nuclear families living in compounds. Child care was often a communal endeavor, with older siblings and grandparents contributing. Birth and fertility rituals were closely linked to agricultural cycles, with songs and ceremonies honoring both human and plant fertility. The symbolism of seeds extends beyond their physical form. Seeds embody potential, carrying within them the blueprint of future life. Ancient farmers recognized this and treated seeds with reverence. In Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries celebrated Demeter and Persephone through secret rituals involving grain, promising initiates a blessed afterlife. In India, seeds are associated with the deity Brahma, who is often depicted emerging from a lotus seed. In many cultures, seeds were carried as talismans or placed with the dead to ensure rebirth. Today, the exchange of seeds connects gardeners across continents, preserving varieties that might otherwise disappear. Seed libraries lend seeds like books, inviting borrowers to return seeds from their harvest. This practice builds community and preserves genetic diversity, mirroring the ancient practice of saving the best seeds for the next season. The connection between agriculture and astronomy can be seen in monumental constructions around the world. The Great Zimbabwe Complex in southern Africa aligns certain walls with the sunrise at equinoxes. The temple complex at Angkor Wat in Cambodia is oriented so that the sun rises over the central tower on the equinoxes, a possible reference to agricultural cycles. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblo people created petroglyphs that mark solstices and equinoxes with shafts of sunlight. These alignments speak to a desire to harmonize human structures with celestial patterns, ensuring that agricultural activities were synchronized with natural cycles. Observing the heavens offered farmers predictability in a world of uncertainties. Even today, farmers watch the weather and track frost dates, combining modern technology with timeless attentiveness. Alcoholic beverages derived from agriculture influenced social and religious practices. In Mesopotamia, beer was consumed through long straws from communal jars, perhaps to filter out sediments. Hymns to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, describe recipes for brewing. Ancient Egyptians brewed beer and offered it to gods. In the Andes, chicha was used in festivals and political ceremonies, consumed from large shared vessels. Rice wine played a role in Chinese ancestor worship. Honey mead made from wild honey and water predates agriculture and continued to be made by farming peoples. Drinking rituals could formalize alliances, mark transitions, or appease deities. The production of alcohol required surplus grain or fruit, linking it directly to agricultural success. Warfare and defense influenced the shape of farming communities. In Europe, hill forts and oppida overlooked farmland, providing refuge for humans and livestock during raids. Defensive ditches and palisades encircled settlements on the Russian steppes. In West Africa, high earthen walls protected Yoruba towns, with gates controlling access. The need to protect fields and granaries sometimes led to centralized authority, as leaders organized defenses and coordinated responses. Fortifications also served symbolic purposes, asserting territorial claims. Conversely, some societies avoided conflict through mobility. Pastoralists moved away from threats with their herds, while farmers might abandon fields and resettle elsewhere. The choices communities made in response to threat reveal the interplay between agriculture, security, and social organization. Artisanship flourished in farming societies, supported by food surpluses. Bronze casting required complex kilns and molds, skills that developed alongside grain production. Blacksmiths forged plows, sickles, and swords. Jewelers fashioned ornaments from gold, silver, and copper, mined from distant mountains. Carpenters built carts, wheels, and barns. These crafts not only improved agricultural efficiency, but also contributed to cultural expression. Musical instruments, such as the Chinese guzheng or the West African kora, relied on materials cultivated or harvested from farmed environments. Painting and sculpture often depicted pastoral scenes. Even the dyes used to color fabrics came from plants like indigo, madder, and saffron, cultivated and processed through careful labor. The synergy between agriculture and craft enriched daily life and strengthened economies. Education and knowledge transmission in agrarian societies were practical and experiential. Children learned through participation planting seeds, herding goats, fetching water. They observed elders reading signs of weather and soil. Song, story, and proverb served as mnemonic devices. In some cultures, formalized apprenticeship systems developed. Young people trained with master potters, weavers, or scribes. In others, rites of passage marked the transition from childhood to adult responsibilities, often linked to the ability to farm. As writing spread, agricultural manuals like the Roman De Re Rustica or the Chinese Chimen Yaoshu compiled techniques for posterity. These texts reflect a desire to systematize and improve farming, building on generational knowledge. The role of the commons in agricultural societies deserves attention. In medieval Europe, villages held common pastures where villagers grazed livestock. In many indigenous societies, land was held collectively, with families assigned plots to cultivate, while forests and water sources remained communal. Commons management required rules and mutual trust. Overgrazing or overharvesting could degrade the resource, so communities developed norms to regulate usage. The enclosure movement in England, beginning in the 16th century, privatized common lands and disrupted traditional rights, leading to displacement and social unrest. The history of commons shows that collective resource management can succeed when guided by shared values and reciprocal obligations, echoing the communal efforts of the first farmers who built canals and terraces together. Throughout history, plagues and diseases have altered the course of agriculture. The Black Death in the 14th century reduced Europe's population dramatically, leading to labor shortages. Fields lay fallow, wages rose, and serfdom weakened. In the Americas, diseases introduced by Europeans devastated indigenous populations, disrupting agricultural systems and leading to abandonment of fields. These demographic shocks changed land tenure, labor relations, and crop choices. In the long term, they paved the way for different agricultural regimes. Understanding the interplay between disease and farming underscores the importance of health in sustaining food production. Agricultural knowledge is encoded in calendars, weather lore, and farmers' almanacs. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning reflects observation of weather patterns. The Old Farmer's Almanac, first published in the 18th century, combined astronomy, weather forecasts, and planting advice. Similar guides existed in ancient China and Mesopotamia. Even in the absence of written records, oral calendars used reference points such as the blooming of particular flowers to signal planting time. These systems integrate observational science with cultural practice, blending practical guidance with tradition. To consult an almanac is to join a long lineage of farmers seeking harmony with the sky and soil. Modern urban agriculture reconnects city dwellers with the land. Rooftop gardens, community plots, and windowsill herb boxes bring green spaces into dense neighborhoods. Urban farmers cultivate tomatoes, lettuce, herbs, and even small fruit trees. Composting turns kitchen scraps into soil. Beekeeping on balconies and community chicken coops provide honey and eggs. These activities echo the self-sufficiency of rural homesteads. They also foster community as neighbors share seeds, tools, and harvests. In some cities, vacant lots transformed into gardens, reduce heat islands, improve air quality, and offer refuge to pollinators. Urban agriculture demonstrates that the spirit of the first farmers, the desire to cultivate life and sustain community, can flourish even in modern skyscraper landscapes. The first farmers did not simply grow food, they cultivated worlds of meaning. The patterns of fields, the smell of earth after rain, the sounds of tools working the soil, the taste of freshly baked bread, these became anchors for community life. The passing of seasons marked the passage of time. Agricultural calendars, often based on observations of the sun, moon, and stars, were among the earliest ways people organized and recorded time. In Egypt, the Helaical rising of Sirius signaled the impending flood of the Nile. In Mesoamerica, calendar systems tracked agricultural and ceremonial cycles with remarkable precision. Through these reckonings, farmers synchronized human activities with the rhythms of nature. The development of writing is intimately tied to agriculture. The need to record transactions, to keep track of stored grain, to list offerings to temples, and to communicate laws governing land use spurred the invention of scripts. The earliest known writing, cuneiform, emerged in Sumer around 3200 BCE. Its wedge-shaped impressions on clay tablets began as pictograms of grain, livestock, and numbers. Over time, these symbols evolved into more abstract characters capable of expressing complex ideas. Similarly, in Egypt, hieroglyphics were used to record grain shipments and tax records. Literacy became a tool of administration and control, further entrenching social hierarchies. But it also allowed for the preservation of knowledge, stories, and laws across generations. As agriculture supported larger populations, specialized crafts flourished. Pottery allowed for the storage and transport of food. Weaving and textile production met the need for clothing and trade goods. Metalworking, beginning with copper and later bronze and iron, provided tools that could clear forests, till deeper soils, and defend territories. Each innovation carried both benefits and consequences. Iron plows increased productivity, but also accelerated deforestation and soil erosion. Irrigation systems expanded arable land, but sometimes led to salinization, diminishing fertility. Farmers learned and adapted, sometimes successfully, sometimes at great cost. Trade routes emerged along which agricultural products, raw materials, and manufactured goods flowed. The Silk Road connected China to the Middle East and Europe, carrying silk, spices, and also agricultural crops such as peaches and pears westward and grapes eastward. Camels, domesticated in Arabia around the first millennium BCE, allowed caravans to cross deserts laden with goods. Sailing ships transported grain and olive oil across the Mediterranean. In the Indian Ocean, monsoon winds guided trade between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Agriculture not only fed the traders, but was itself a central commodity. With trade came cultural exchanges, spreading ideas about farming, irrigation, and cuisine. In the medieval period, agricultural innovations continued to shape societies. In Europe, the heavy plow allowed farmers to turn dense clay soils, opening new areas for cultivation. The three-field system rotated crops, one with grains, one with legumes, and one fallow to replenish soil nutrients and increase yields. These changes supported population growth and urbanization. In the Islamic world, advanced irrigation techniques and new crops such as rice, cotton, and citrus were spread across a vast empire. Agricultural manuals written in Arabic, Persian, and other languages compiled knowledge about grafting, pruning, fertilizing, and managing water. The diffusion of these techniques through Spain into Europe had a lasting impact on agriculture. On other continents, indigenous agricultural systems remained, highly adapted to their environments. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples practiced mosaic burning and caretaking of native plant stands. In the Pacific Islands, Polynesians cultivated taro in wet fields and sweet potatoes in dry uplands, using compost pits to maintain fertility. They also developed aquaculture, farming fish in lagoons and channels. These practices reflect a deep understanding of ecological relationships and resource cycles. The first farmers in these regions did not simply impose human order on nature. They worked with it, acknowledging its rhythms and limits. As European exploration and colonization expanded after 1500, the interchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds, often called the Columbian Exchange, transformed agriculture globally. Maize, potatoes, and tomatoes traveled to Europe, Asia, and Africa, where they became staples. Wheat, barley, pigs, and horses were introduced to the Americas. The adoption of potatoes in Europe, for instance, allowed populations to grow in regions where grain yields were limited by climate. In Ireland, the reliance on a single variety of potato would later make the population vulnerable to blight, leading to famine and mass immigration. The spread of crops and livestock connected by global trade networks underscores how agriculture has been both a driver and a beneficiary of human connectivity. Agriculture's evolution did not stop with traditional practices. The modern world has seen the development of industrial agriculture, characterized by mechanization, synthetic fertilizers, and global markets. The harnessing of fossil fuels allowed tractors to plow fields quickly, combining and thrashing grain in a fraction of the time human labor once required. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, created through the Haber-Bosch process in the early 20th century, dramatically increased yields. These advances supported unprecedented population growth, but also introduced new issues: soil degradation, water pollution from runoff, reliance on fossil fuels, and the erosion of traditional knowledge. The intimate relationship between farmers and their land has, in some places, been replaced by large-scale operations dependent on industrial inputs. Reflecting on the story of the first farmers invites contemplation of what was gained and what was lost. Farming allowed for greater control over food supply, leading to surpluses that enabled specialization, art, science, and urban life. It supported the growth of civilizations, the creation of monumental architecture, and the development of writing and law. It also brought about social hierarchies, land ownership, and organized warfare. The diets of early farmers were less diverse, and their health often declined relative to their foraging ancestors. Population density facilitated the spread of infectious diseases. The environment was altered, sometimes irreparably, through deforestation, soil erosion, and the loss of biodiversity. Agriculture gave humans power over plants and animals, but it also bound them to the rhythms of the seasons and to the land they cultivated. Within the gentle flow of this narrative, one can sense the weight of time and the myriad choices made by countless individuals. A woman in ancient Syria saving the plumpest seeds. A man in early China learning to transplant rice seedlings in neat rows. A family in the Andes carving terraces from a mountainside. Children in a Mesoamerican village planting beans at the base of corn stalks. Elders in an African savanna teaching the value of sorghum that withstands drought. Each act of planting, tending, harvesting, and saving seed was a small step in the grand transformation that is agriculture. Each step was made with care, observation, and adaptation. Over generations, these steps added up to a process that reshaped human society and the planet. The effects of the first farmers reverberate into our own lives. The bread you may eat, the rice you cook, the maize in your morning cereal. These foods are direct descendants of those early domesticates. The social structures we inhabit, the cities we live in, the laws that govern property and trade these two, have roots in that long-ago shift to cultivation and settlement. Even the way we conceive of time divided into agricultural seasons, workdays, and cycles of growth echoes the practices of our farming ancestors. We are the heirs of their curiosity, their diligence, their willingness to shape and be shaped by the living world around them. As the narration continues, the pace slows further, drawing attention to the quieter moments within this sweeping history. Picture a person in a small ancient village stepping softly across a courtyard, carrying a basket of grain. The sun is low, casting warm light that glimmers on the smooth plastered walls. Dust motes dance in the beams, swirling lazily in the still air. Somewhere, a child laughs, and a dog barks once before settling down. The fields beyond the village rustle with the sound of wind through stalks. There is work to do, always work, but there are also moments of rest, of sitting by a doorway and watching light and shadow move across the floor. These small scenes give texture to the larger narrative, grounding the vast arc of history in lived experience. Now imagine the feeling of cool stone under your feet as you walk through a Neolithic home. The floor is worn smooth by generations of bare footsteps. You pass a hearth, its ashes cold for now, but still faintly scented with the memory of meals cooked long ago. On a low platform, dried bundles of herbs hang from a beam, their subtle aromas mixing with the earthy smell of the plaster walls. In the corner sits a clay jar sealed with a flat stone. Inside, seeds wait for the next planting season. These are seeds that have been carefully chosen and safeguarded, representing hope and continuity. The quiet simplicity of this room belies the complexity of knowledge and effort required to sustain it. Beyond the physical spaces, there is the soundscape of agricultural life. In the early morning, roosters crow and goats bleat. Wooden wheels of irrigation devices creak as they lift water from canals to fields. In the distance, a flute might play, its notes mingling with the whisper of wind. In China, the rhythmic splash of water scooped by bamboo chain pumps provides a constant background as farmers tend their paddy fields. In Egypt, the calls of workers along the Nile coordinate efforts to open or close sluice gates. In Andean terraces, the hum of voices and the occasional whistle float through the thin mountain air. Auditory memories like these anchor our sense of place and time, linking us to those who came before. As night deepens, the narrative turns inward, contemplating the meaning of these changes. What does it mean to domesticate a plant or an animal? The act carries both care and control. To plant a seed is to trust that it will grow, but also to expect something from it. To domesticate an animal is to foster a relationship that benefits humans while altering the animal's natural behavior. These relationships involve responsibility. Farmers must protect their crops from pests and drought. They must feed and shelter their animals. In return, the plants and animals provide sustenance, materials, and sometimes companionship. This reciprocity is at the core of agriculture. It is a contract between species renewed each season. In some traditions, this contract is acknowledged through rituals. In parts of Africa, farmers pour a libation of the first millet beer on the ground in gratitude. In Japan, rice planting ceremonies bless the fields and honor the kami, or spirits, believed to inhabit them. In North America, indigenous peoples hold potlatches or harvest feasts, sharing food and stories to strengthen community bonds. These rituals remind participants that they are part of a larger web of life. They celebrate the cycles of sowing and reaping, of scarcity and abundance. Even if you do not participate in such rituals today, the echoes of these practices remain in festivals like Thanksgiving or in the simple act of saying grace before a meal. The story also invites reflection on resilience. Across the ages, farmers have faced uncertainties, unpredictable weather, plant diseases, locust swarms, flooding rivers. They develop strategies to cope, storing surplus grain, diversifying crops, breeding resilient varieties, and seeking knowledge from elders and neighbors. In the archaeological record, we see evidence of adaptation. Fields move to higher ground to escape rising waters, switch to drought-tolerant crops during dry spells, or the building of terraces to prevent soil erosion. These responses show the ingenuity of the first farmers and their descendants. They remind us that flexibility and foresight have always been essential for survival. The narrative acknowledges the complexity of evaluating agriculture. It was neither purely beneficial nor purely detrimental. It led to the flourishing of cultures and also to the emergence of inequality. It provided security and also introduced new risks. Some scholars, like the biologist who described agriculture as the worst mistake in the history of the human race, point to evidence that early farmers worked longer hours and had poorer health than their hunter-gatherer counterparts. Others highlight the incredible developments that farming made possible: music, art, literature, science. Both perspectives hold truth. Agriculture is a human endeavor, with all the imperfections, compromises, and achievements inherent in human endeavors. As your breathing slows, think of the land itself. Agriculture has shaped landscapes, terraces carving contours into mountains, irrigation canals tracing veins across plains, hedgerows dividing fields. These human-made features become part of the natural scenery, homes for birds, insects, and small mammals. The domesticated plants and animals themselves have evolved alongside humans. Wheat no longer scatters its seeds at the slightest breeze. Cows produce milk far beyond the needs of their calves. Humanity's influence has become part of the evolutionary story of many species. We have become co-creators of ecosystems, for better and for worse. In recent decades, there has been a growing appreciation for the knowledge of indigenous and small-scale farmers. Their understanding of soil health, seed saving, intercropping, and biodiversity is invaluable in an era of climate change and environmental degradation. Traditional practices like agroforestry, rotating grazing, and seed exchanges maintain resilience and adaptability. In Latin America, milpa systems combine maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers in a single plot, fostering soil health and dietary diversity. In parts of Africa, zai pits concentrate moisture and nutrients in arid soils. These techniques, rooted in ancient practices, demonstrate the continuing relevance of the first farmer's wisdom. There is a sense of continuity that connects past and present, suggesting that solutions to modern challenges may lie in older ways of thinking. The journey draws toward its end. In the stillness of the night, imagine stepping out into a field under a starry sky. The plants are silent and yet alive, gently releasing moisture into the cool air. A crescent moon hangs low, casting pale light that glints on dewdrops. You feel the solid earth beneath your feet, the faint scent of soil and greenery. In the distance, you might hear the soft low of cattle or the rustle of leaves. This is the same night sky under which countless generations of farmers have looked up, wondering when to plant, how to harvest, and what kind of future their children would have. Their hopes and fears, their daily labors, and their moments of joy have contributed to the tapestry of human history. Our story has circled through regions and eras, from the earliest experiments in seed planting to the complexity of modern agriculture. It has visited river valleys, mountain terraces, tropical forests, and desert oases. It has listened to the voices of people who long ago made decisions that still influence the world. In telling this story slowly and softly, we honor the patience and persistence required to coax life from the earth. We recognize that behind every loaf of bread, bowl of rice, or ear of corn is a lineage of plants and people entwined. We acknowledge that while agriculture has changed us, we have also changed agriculture, creating a shared future that continues to evolve. As you drift toward sleep, let the final images settle gently. Picture an ancient seed cradled in a farmer's hand, ready to be pressed into damp soil. Picture a line of women planting rice seedlings in a flooded paddy, their feet submerged, their arms moving with practiced grace. Picture a child in a village somewhere long ago, running between rows of tall maize, his laughter carried by the wind. These images are small threads in a vast tapestry, connecting us across time and space. The first farmers changed human history not through sudden upheaval, but through countless acts of care and intention. Their legacy lives in the landscapes we inhabit and the meals we share. In the quiet conclusion, the narrator's voice softens even further. We have walked through ancient fields and along riverbanks, through highland terraces and lush valleys. We have listened to the whispers of history carried by the wind. The story of the first farmers is not merely about the past, it is about relationships with the earth, with one another, and with the future. As you rest, carry with you the gentle knowledge that every seed planted has a story, every meal eaten a history. Let this awareness be a comfort and a guide. Good night.